Hi and welcome to the channel. This video I want to make just to come back on some of the feedback I've had in the previous video we did last week. This video is going to look at all the global data around COVID, and I'm going to compare and contrast some of the metrics and the statistics that are coming out from every single country. How have I managed to do that? Well, I've found a source online which brings 147 different data points from every country in the world, and we have collated that together so we can now start to tell stories knowing what we know about each country. So let's dive in and see what every country's been doing, shall we? So what you'll see on the screen here is a spreadsheet full of data, and I want to cover 7 things. I want to look at the cases, which is in column C here. Does it tell us about the case volume, the infection volume? 2, I want to look at the global data and see what the rates are. 3, there's a story here. We now know what certain countries have done, and we want to be able to understand whether there's been positive or negative impact. 4, it's important to then prorata that to a per capita or per million population, and we can start to analyse what that means. Filter it by country. So there's lots of differences in countries. First world, third world, highly dispersed, very packed and dense population countries, and I want to see what the variance is there. Second to last, I want to look at the death rate. That is significant, and there are quite different variances across the countries. Some will surprise you. And then finally, something that everybody's talking about is this testing rate. More testing equals better information, which means we can drive the R number down, etc., etc. Is that truly the case? And spoiler, not necessarily, but you need to watch to find out. So let's dive in and look at the first one, which is cases. So column C here shows number of cases, and we have 47.3 million cases globally. That is significant, and what that means is that there are, unfortunately, going to be a significant number of deaths if we have to be believed. But when we look at the data, we only have 1.2 million deaths globally, and that's out of a population of 7.7 billion people. When you add up all the people in the world, it comes to about 7.7. When you check it with other data sets, it's give or take within about 0.1%. These are the government's own data sets, so they're pretty accurate. What that means is we have an average global infection rate of 0.6%. That's not very high. When we spoke in the video the other day, we were looking at an average rate during the peak of the pandemic in the UK of about 2%, and that had come down to about 0.75% as of a couple of days ago. So it hovers around sort of 1.5, 2% in the UK. What that means is that we have an average recovery rate. So of everyone who gets infected, 72% will recover. But that doesn't mean that 28% will die. What that means is, according to the way this data is classified, we have active cases, as you'll see here in column H, and those active cases mean that we don't have recovery yet. Those are people still ongoing, and different countries report in different ways. So the data is slightly skewed, and I'm going to leave recovery rate because it's not necessarily a good indicator on this data. However, we do then have death rate. So what this data shows is the average death rate is about 2.5%, but that's not 2.5% of the population. That's 2.5% of those who are infected. So 2.5% of 0.6 globally. And what that means is the overall death rate of COVID-19 is 0.02%. It's tiny. It's minuscule in the global sense of things. And we have an overall testing rate of 10%. So let's look at the data and let's dive into the stories here. The cases tell us an interesting story. We have a highly significant variance from almost 10 million cases in the USA, which we all know about. There's a huge difference by state by state. I think Massachusetts is completely locked down, but there's a variance in the number of cases across the USA. India, that was in the news. That was the up and coming area for the pandemic. 8 million cases there, 5 million Brazil, and then we take a steep dive down to Russia, France, Spain. UK is down at position number 8. Which is, position number 9, which is 1 million, and then we start to deep dive. And the story of cases, when you look at this data, and I'm going to compare cases with population and such like here, is quite interesting. So the second thing I wanted to cover was the story of different countries. And if I come all the way down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that all the countries in the bottom, typically, bar a couple of outliers, are very, very small nations. The island nations, Pacific nations, those in Asia, with some in Africa as well as Asia, who don't seem to have, I'm going to say, trustworthy data. This is the source and we have to go with what they have, but we have Laos on one occasion that's saying they have like 24 infections with a population of 7 million. Do we believe that? Likewise, we have Tanzania, 60 million with 509. Again, it's outliers, it's down at the bottom of the data, but we're going to sort of ignore it for just now because it's not part of the story that we're trying to highlight. We come to an interesting one, which is New Zealand, at position 160. Now, New Zealand did something very interesting very early on. And what they did was they prevented access to the country. The minute COVID broke out, the Prime Minister took the decision to lock the country down. I don't mean lock the population down. I mean lock the country down, as in protect the border. And as a result, they've got less than 2,000 cases, the entirety of the pandemic. So less than 2,000 cases in a population of 5 million. When you put that in context, that's the population nearly of Norway, Scotland, London. It's less than London, it's less than Scotland. And to have an infection rate of 1.96%, which means the actual infection rate is 0.04. What that means is 4 people in every 1,000 will have COVID walking around. That's nearly almost immunity. But what they've done is, it's a very safe place to be in New Zealand right now. They don't have a great testing compared to other countries. They've got an average, 22%. And the death rate, those people who do get COVID have a 1% chance, roughly 1.2% chance of dying from COVID. However, they locked the country down. So when we spoke in the last video around input, country, output, or income, visitors, people in the country and leavers, what they took the decision to do was lock the country down. So people entering the country, if they were allowed to enter the country, had to isolate for 14 days, had to get several tests, and only once they were shown to be negative could they enter the country. They physically controlled the bio-entry of that country, and that prevented spread. There was a minor influx of disease, and what they've now done is they've started to control that through minor restrictions that they've put in place. So New Zealand, if we take that as a baseline of roughly 2,000 cases and 5 million population, we can now compare and contrast, knowing what they did, what other countries did. And when I zoom up to Australia, again carrying on the story, Australia has nigh on 28,000 cases. So that's roughly 14 times more than New Zealand had. But their population is more than 5 times more. So 14 times cases with a 5 times the size of population. When you divide one by the other, it's roughly a 3-fold increase. 3-fold increase. So from that perspective, that's not great as to what they do. Now, what they've had to do is they have invoked a local lockdown. And this is where I want to get into the story of lockdowns. They physically locked the external border and the internal borders down. They didn't originally. They had more lax external borders, and people were still free and able to go. They also were able to come into the country, self-isolate. Not everybody did, and the virus transmitted. Once it was in the country, just like you have with the fruits and the vegetables and the biosecurity that Australia always has had for protection, the virus propagated and it started to spike in areas like Victoria. Victoria's in a 4.5-month lockdown, just coming out, I believe. And what they've now done, if you look at the data, is have a spike way up of about 800-900 cases a day that's now come down to almost 0. As of yesterday, they had 5 cases that were live and 0 in hospital out of the whole of the state of Victoria. That's a phenomenal task. And what they've done is they locked the country down, external borders, and then they locked the population down. So they physically controlled movement. So that goes to show, and it proves that physical lockdowns do work. But what they did was they took 2 steps. They locked the border first, and then they locked the population. They controlled the environment, and then they controlled the virus. And this is the next step. So Australia took 1 step further than New Zealand. They took it later because they took the decision later, and therefore they had to take a higher and more radical approach. So they locked the entire country down. Therefore, they've had a higher incidence of cases for the higher population, pro rata. And what that means is they've now had to take a higher response. I'm going to bypass Sweden quickly just to bring the UK into scope here as well. But when you bring Sweden into scope, looking at the UK, because we also had lockdown, but Sweden did not. Sweden has not locked its population down. It has not prevented its economy from operating. It has not put major restrictions in place. It's minor, and I mean minor restrictions. Things like less than 50 people can still meet at a social gathering. They have not had the rule of six. They have not had physical movement restriction. They have had open borders effectively with Norway, etc. And populations have been free to roam. Now what that's meant is their cases have gone through the roof, relatively. They have taken the approach, because their government is separate to their public health. The public health drive and control what is happening and inform the government what they will do. There is no government intervention, there is no bartering for money, there is no backhand, there's no anything in negotiation terms that the UK is doing. The Swedish government stay out of the public health of the country, and the Public Health Authority decides what needs to be done based on health evidence and tells the government what needs to be done, and it's done. So they took the decision to leave the borders open. They had 124,000 cases since the pandemic started. Now, compared to Australia, which had its 27,000, and New Zealand, which had 2, that is 60 times more than New Zealand. And their population is only twice the population of New Zealand. So they had 60 more cases for twice the population. So that's a 30-fold increase overall, a worse response to COVID. That's pretty poor when you look at it. But actually, is it poor? Because now data, when you look at one point, can be misinterpreted. When you look at the whole story, Sweden took its decision to open its borders. Its cases rocketed through the roof. If we look at the information the UK government's giving us, that is to be believed that's catastrophic. However, its infection rate still remains, with a rampant virus, at 1.2% of the population infected. They've had 2 million tests, almost as much as the UK, and still only 1% of the population is infected. Its death rate, though, is quite high. It's one of the highest. It's 4.78%. And that's because they took the decision this was a personal response. And that personal response was your own responsibility to keep safe. And the virus obviously spreads through people who are older, who are non-white, who are in ill health, and anyone who's underlying health conditions, etc. They are, unfortunately, the situation that makes it worse. And because the virus has been left unchecked, the death rate has gone through the roof. However, relatively through the roof. However, the testing rate is still pretty good. It's about the same as Australia and New Zealand, 22%. So testing, which I'll come back to, is just as high as other countries. Other countries took a lockdown decision, even with the testing, and drove the virus out. But first of all, they locked the country down. So now on one side, we have Sweden at open border side, we have New Zealand and Australia at closed border side, and we have pretty much the same infection rate of 1%. Now, what that means is, when Sweden is opening lots of borders, or has open borders, cases through the roof, and you have Australia and New Zealand which do not, we're in a situation where the UK now finds itself in the middle, and we are keeping our borders somewhat open. We have flights coming and going, there's lots of cancellations, people are free to travel. We have different countries every month or every second week which are on and off the no-fly list. And what that means is people then have to kind of self-manage the self-isolation. And do they really do it? Well, probably not. And that's borne out when you look at the UK's cases. We have 1 million cases. For a 68 million population, we have we have 7 times the population of Sweden, and we have 9 times the cases. So we are worse than Sweden, and yet we locked our populations down, now coming up for twice. We've got tiered systems in Scotland and England. We've had official lockdowns in Wales. We had a huge lockdown over the spring. So it goes to show, whilst Australia locked the border down, Australia locked the country down, so did the UK. But the UK's have skyrocketed on a per capita basis, whereas Australia and New Zealand has not. So the only difference is locking the external border. So the UK has not managed this proportionally or well because we have not locked the external border. We still have people flying in, we still have people coming in on ferries, across on planes, And we should not be allowing this to happen, because that continues the fresh infection coming in. But look at the infection rate. We still, like Sweden, with a free population to move, only have a 1.55% infection rate. So what does that mean? We have killed the economy. We have locked the population down. We have cancelled operations. We've put the NHS under pressure. And yet the biometric, the infection rate, remains the same as a country that has not done that, has let the population move with minor restrictions. So the data would show that there is no need for lockdown unless you want to kill the virus. Now back to Australia and New Zealand very quickly. They have killed the virus effectively in their country, but they've only done that because they've stopped the input and output of people. The minute they open those borders and new people come in, they reinfect the country, and they're going to have to keep doing this. And this is the pattern the data shows. It's peaks and troughs, peaks and troughs, peaks and troughs. Every time we lock it down, the virus of course comes down. The minute we allow social movement, the virus goes up. And if we're only infecting on a yearly basis, say 2% of the population, we are going to need, assuming a 50% herd immunity, about 20 years to infect everybody else if it's a linear progression, which it's showing at this point in time. If you think about SARS, SARS is still around. We don't have a vaccine for it. And therefore the hope we have a vaccine for this every single year, which will be it's a flu type virus, will change and mutate, is something that we need to look at here. So from an infection rate of 1.5%, it's not a great position in the UK. The UK has tried to be the best of both worlds and messed up both worlds. We've not locked the country down in terms of external borders. We've kept those open. So fresh input of disease, more people going out the country on holiday, coming back, bringing it with them, reinfecting other people or infecting other people. People, like I said, leaving the country and coming back. The borders are open, you're going to bring in virus. Australia and New Zealand didn't stop the virus. Australia did what New Zealand did not and locked the country down and brought the curve down to near zero. That's what we need to do. So if the UK wants to make this lockdown successful, what it needs to do is 1, close the borders. 2, lock the nation down for 4 to 6 weeks. That will kill every form of the virus twice. It's a 3-week, roughly 3 to 4 week incubation. And if you lock it down for 6 weeks, you should kill any people who have just been infected, those who are infected, or those who are exiting the infection. You should kill the virus in those people, and most of those people will recover. And then we get to areas further up, like Spain, France, etc. We're following France and we're following Spain. France and Spain have just announced a 4-week lockdown, which again doesn't make sense. France and Germany have just announced a lockdown, which doesn't make sense. France has 1.5 million, roughly, cases that have been announced with a population of 65 million. Population of about the same as us, 50% more infections. So it's worse in France than it is in the UK, right? And we're told we're 4 weeks behind France. However, Germany's done the same thing. And they have a third, half of our infections and a third of France, with a population that's greater. So their infection rate is even lower. So why on earth are they going into lockdown? The spread of the virus in Germany is even less. Now, they have open borders as well, so there could be cross-contamination and cross-infection, and that's a Schengen-type issue. But the data here, when you look at countries' comparison and what they're doing, does not support the fact that lockdowns do not work unless you are doing a short, sharp shock, like the reset, the circuit breaker they talked about. But to do that correctly, you have to go back to closed borders. You have to seal the box, tape it up, and contain the virus in that country. No one else has done that. So that's the story of how the countries. Now I want to look at cases per million population. When we prorata this up and look at it on a per capita basis, where are the places in the world that you really don't want to be to likely get coronavirus? Well, this is where the map changes, and you'll see I've highlighted on the screen already some of the countries I'm talking about. Well, a lot of the ones that no one's talking about are highest on the list when you put it per capita. Belgium suddenly appears. That's one we're not really talking about. Belgium has a quite high rate, an infection rate twice, 3 times that of the UK. Almost 50% more than the USA. So the US and Brazil and all these other countries talking about the hardship they're suffering. Belgium has an even worse case. You got Bahrain and Qatar. Those are significantly higher. Those are 2 times higher. That's significant. Andorra is a tiny nation, so we can kind of look at that as between France and Spain. But when you change the chart to show countries differently, it knocks what we're doing right down, and we're looking at things in the wrong perspective here, because these other countries are not being discussed, they're not being looked at, and all their responses are not in proportion to what we're doing. So the infection rates are higher elsewhere, and yet we still have people traveling from all these countries to our country, which is where it comes from. So the infection rate is higher. Now let's look at population difference. If we want to look at the actual populations of the country, clearly this is just a list of the most populous countries. China first, India second, US third, etc., etc. And then when we look at the infection rate of those countries across the whole of the pandemic per population, China is the best. It had the lowest. It was a highly contained, highly focused response to COVID-19. Highly, very good response rate in terms of recovery. Death rate, the highest, one of the highest we have, right? Of the ones I'm going to highlight here. Unfortunately, they are clear and they're moving. India, another one we've talked about, where the population's been put under mass lockdown. Infection rate's pretty low, but the population's quite sparse. It lives in villages, and if it's not in slums or high dense population, for such dense population, the infection rate's quite low. So again, the challenge is, and it's median point for the world, the challenge is this infection really that infectious, and does it work? The data doesn't support that. Going through these other countries, you have to get all the way down to largest countries, whereas the UK is way down here at 68 million. The infection rate of the top countries, Brazil, Mexico, we have the highest. They have the highest death rates, with China in there, and the infection rate is still low. So the death rate is a correlation to perhaps the health system and the way the disease is transmitting locally. But the infection rate remains consistent, hovering, with the exception of the USA, at below or around 1%. So something's not right here. That's the population difference. Now I want to look at death rate. When you look at the death rate of people who have died with COVID-19, okay, so what that means is they are infected and then they die, not the overall death rate for the country, because that skews it by population. This is those who actually caught it. Otherwise, you're skewing the data. It's clear when you go through the data, the highest death rates in terms of chances of dying. Interestingly, if you live in the UK and the Isle of Man, your chance of dying from COVID is pretty high if you catch it. Mexico, like I said, one of the highest. Yemen, Sahara, the African countries are right at the top here. But look in terms of the highlighted yellow countries, Sweden and the UK. We are very similar, Sweden and the UK, in terms of what we're doing. And this is why I come back to my point around they haven't locked their country down. They have taken the decision that they are going to accept nature, and that the virus will migrate, and that they're not going to kill their economy, they're not going to damage the country, and yet people will have to have the self determination to protect themselves. And this is where persona-based risk assessment needs to come in, I believe, and I'll do another video on that later on. But what that means is there's different risk factors and percentages of dying or being infected depending on which category you're in, based on health, ethnicity, gender, the age bracket, etc. So from that perspective, Sweden and the UK are very similar. When you compare these two countries, unlike Australia and New Zealand, Sweden's had none of the restrictions that we've had. We have passed into law restrictions that restrict mobility, restrict ability to challenge authority, to do certain things, and civil liberties have been removed. Sweden's had none of that. They're a very matrix organisation. They have a very sort of mutual appreciation of each other, and it's based upon the fact that you are a citizen. They have high infection rate, 124,000. We have 1.1 almost million cases of a population that's 7 times the size, but we have 9 times the case rate. So our pro rata is not similar. And unfortunately, we have the similar death rate. So 2 Western countries have a very similar infection rate, almost identical, and almost identical death rate. Our death rate is lower than Sweden, fractionally, but our infection rate is slightly higher. So again, this varies over time, so let's assume it's the same. And there you look at Australia. So Australia is a lot lower in terms of infection rate, but it's higher than other countries in terms of death rate. So even though they locked down, there's something in the population there where the death rate was higher. So that's the other point. The last thing I want to look at, which is really, really interesting because it's something that everyone goes on about, is testing. The challenge is the more testing we do, the more we drive down the COVID number. Is that true? Well, let's look at the testing rate. If we look at the tests per million population and we break the data down into all the different countries, right? So this is the number of tests that we've completed per million population, effectively. It doesn't mean that those people have been tested because people could have been tested twice or 3 times. It's the actual number of tests versus the population. So on a pro capita basis. Very interesting, and I have to say, big up for the UK. We are the highest, most tested nation on the planet with a population greater than 10 million. As you'll see here from the population line, all the smaller nations, with the exception of like Israel and the UAE, they're much, much smaller nations, you know, Singapore, Denmark, etc. Countries the size of 1 or 2 times the size of Scotland or London. Everything else is tiny, tiny nations. The first nation of any significance with testing capacity is the UK. We have tested on average roughly 47% of the entire country so far. I know we haven't, but it's on a pro rata basis, it works out to about 47%. And that is where the data shows. You know, the USA is next. It's almost behind us. So they are testing as well. In a country 5 times our size, that's pretty impressive. You keep going all the way down to other countries that we start to try and emulate. And there's Sweden and New Zealand, you know, down at the 20%. So we are testing more than twice as many people as Sweden and New Zealand. But guess what? This is where the story comes back to several data points. Sweden hasn't locked anyone down. The virus has got a 1.2% infection rate. New Zealand locked everybody down, and therefore the infection rate is really low. It's 0.04%. The reason it's so low and it's an outlier is because very early on they locked the whole place down, and therefore the virus could not really spread, and anything that did spread was disproportionately low. So the key factor that I think has to be taken into account is 1, lock the border. Protect the border. Bio border, physical border, that has to be protected. 2, once you've done that, you then focus in on the country. Do you really need to lock the population down? Well, this is where Sweden comes in. So Sweden didn't lock the border. Sweden let population move. They put in minor restrictions, like I said, 50 number of people moving around and having a social gathering, 50 people. But the virus is still 1% infection rate. UK locked everyone down in March, April, May, came out in June. We then had a swathe of local restrictions and we're going back in. We still have a 1.5% infection rate. Lockdown therefore has limited difference between Sweden and the UK. You look at other countries as well. Russia, no lockdowns, 1.1% infection rate. The story keeps going and going and going. So lockdown does not seem to have any effect on biotransmission at all. It's locking the border down and stopping people coming in that prevents new infection coming in. Then controlling the infection in the country is the way to go. And by saying you need more and more testing, that just tells you who has it. It doesn't drive the number down. What you need to do is then have the restrictions. So the output of this video, what does the data tell us? 1, lock the border. 2, short, sharp lockdown. 4 weeks max, and unfortunately, yes, lockdown does work. Australia and New Zealand shows this, but they locked the borders. When they didn't lock the borders, Australia had a spike and they had to lock the borders and lock the nation down to get it back down. Sweden did not, and the virus spread at 1.2%. So the issue is, do you go all the way to the left-hand side with Australia or all the way to the right-hand side with Sweden? And the UK being in the middle has seen the worst of both worlds. So the middle is not where to be. You need to take a stand. Either the UK needs to suck it up and say, like Sweden, we accept the death rate of about 4.5% of those who get infected, which means there will be a significant number of people who die, about 250,000 people will die. Or we go lockdown, but we do it properly. And if we do it properly, it only needs to last 4 to 6 weeks, and then we open the whole country up, but we lock the borders. Nobody in, nobody out. And that is how Australia and New Zealand are controlling it. Because the minute you open that border, it's going to come back in. And if we're only infecting, say, 2% of the population, if we need 50% to get immunity, it's going to take 10 years plus, even with compounded infection rates, to have the whole country there. And your vaccine will change every year, just like the flu vaccine. So to recap, I think the UK has it wrong. My previous video suggested that the model was wrong. I still think that's correct. Global data says that different countries' approaches have had different outputs. And when you analyze them and compare them, which is what we do in my job, those videos, those data points tell us that countries who did the right thing seem to lock the country down from the outside input. They locked the country down for a short period where they had to. Australia had to lock it down longer because they didn't lock the border. That's the key lesson there. And then people like Sweden, who didn't lock the border, have accepted the consequences. So you can't have the best of both worlds, which is what the UK is trying to do. And therefore, you have to make a choice. So really, put in the comments below, what do you think? Choice, accept the consequences. Human life is valuable, therefore we lock the country down. If we lock the country down, we kill the economy as we've been doing, 300 million over the last 7 months. And we put everyone out of work anyway. So no one's going to win here, and the government has a tough job. Testing is not going to give you more data. Testing seems to be irrelevant, and we are the highest testing nation of the planet with a population above 10 million, significantly above 10 million. So overall, I think we need to lock the country down for 4 weeks, only 4 weeks, and then forget about it. But we have to lock the border. Locking the border is what we need to do. Once we control the virus is going to spread within the country, and it's going to spread about 1.2, 1.5% of the population. Of that, approximately 4.5% of people, unfortunately, will die. However, those data points are for the whole pandemic. The other video I put on my channel showed the current data points for the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So from that perspective, please subscribe to the channel. I'm going to keep making these videos to try and explain what's going on here. I think it's really interesting looking at the data because it does answer a lot of the problems that people are discussing and where they just don't really understand it at all. And it's starting to give me some clarity and hope give you some clarity. So thank you for watching, and subscribe and give me a like if you enjoyed this video. Thank you. Bye-bye.